They didn't call them dwarves in the official reports. They used clinical terms like persons of diminutive stature or individuals of unusual proportion. But the workers who found them, the ones who actually stood in those flooded tunnels beneath what would become Lake Mead, they knew what they were looking at, and they knew enough to stop talking about it. I wasn't researching Nevada's water history when I found this. I was tracing dam construction records, looking for budget discrepancies in the Hoover Dam project. Standard investigative work, the kind that usually uncovers nothing more interesting than accounting errors. But then I found a work order from 1832, decades before Hoover Dam, for a structure that shouldn't exist. A dam in Nevada, built before Nevada was even a state, constructed in a location that modern engineers insist would have been impossible with the technology supposedly available. And the reason given for its construction made no sense whatsoever. The official explanation, when you can find one, claims it was a small irrigation project. Except irrigation for what? The region was documented as uninhabited desert. No settlements, no farms, no population that would justify the expense and engineering required to divert an entire river system. Yet the construction records are there, buried in territorial archives, describing a project of staggering scale undertaken with remarkable speed. 3 months. That's how long the documents claim it took to build a dam, capable of flooding an area that would eventually hold what we now call Lake Mead's predecessor. 3 months using technology from the 1830s to accomplish what modern crews with industrial equipment would struggle to complete in 3 years. The work orders describe hundreds of labourers, but here's where it gets strange. No payment records exist for these workers, no supply chain documentation for feeding or housing them, no injury reports, no labour disputes, nothing that would indicate a massive construction project employing that many people. Just the dam itself, and a single notation in the completion report that makes my skin crawl every time I read it. Site cleared, previous structures submerged as planned, no complications. Previous structures, in uninhabited desert, submerged as planned. I started pulling every map I could find of Nevada from the 1820s and 1830s. French maps, Spanish maps, American territorial surveys. And here's what I found. Before 1832, several maps show small settlements in the exact area that would be flooded. Not Native American villages, the cartographic symbols are wrong for that. These are marked with the same symbols used for established towns, complete with what appears to be infrastructure, roads, maybe even aqueducts. After 1835, those same maps are redrawn. The settlements are gone. The area is labelled as uninhabited wasteland, not abandoned, not destroyed by natural disaster, simply erased as if they never existed. But someone remembered. Because in 1931, when excavation began for the actual Hoover Dam, workers started finding things that shouldn't be there. The official reports describe them as Native American artifacts of unusual construction, except these weren't arrowheads or pottery. These were worked stone structures, foundations, what appeared to be building remnants, built at a scale that made no sense. The doorways measured 3 to 4 feet high. The furniture, when they found any, was proportioned for people no taller than a child. And the construction technique didn't match anything in the archaeological record of the region. This wasn't adobe. This wasn't the traditional building methods of any known southwestern tribe. This was cut stone precisely fitted, built to last centuries. I found a photograph. Just one. It survived in a private collection, never officially catalogued, never studied. It shows a work crew standing in what's labelled as a drainage tunnel during Hoover Dam construction. But in the background, partially visible through the excavated earth, you can see it. A doorway, perfectly arched, maybe 3.5 feet tall, leading into darkness. The stonework is too precise, too deliberate to be natural formation. The photo is dated 1932. There's no follow-up documentation, no archaeological survey, no preservation effort, just a work order from 2 weeks later, authorizing the tunnel to be filled with concrete and sealed permanently. Why would you seal a potential archaeological discovery instead of studying it? Why would you deliberately bury evidence of a civilization that predated known settlement in the region? Unless you already knew what was down there and had specific orders to ensure it stayed buried. The workers talked, though, not officially, not in any records that were meant to be preserved, but in letters home, in diary entries, in conversations overheard and noted by family members who didn't understand the significance at the time. They described finding chambers, rooms built into the rock itself, proportioned for inhabitants of extraordinary small stature. They described skeletal remains, dozens of them, all measuring between 3 and 4 feet in length. And they described something else, something that appears in multiple independent accounts, mentioned with the kind of detail that suggests these men saw something they couldn't explain and couldn't forget. The remains weren't scattered. They weren't in burial positions. They were clustered together in what appeared to be living spaces, as if whatever happened had happened suddenly, catching an entire population in their homes. The 1832 dam didn't just flood empty desert. It flooded an inhabited area, deliberately and quickly. And 70 years later, when the Hoover Dam project began excavating the same region, someone made very sure that whatever evidence remained would never see daylight again. But evidence has a way of surfacing, because the lake level isn't constant. It rises and falls with drought and rainfall. And during severe droughts, when the water recedes far enough, things that were meant to stay submerged start appearing again. In 2002, during one of the worst droughts in decades, a fishing guide named Michael Chen noticed something unusual along the northeastern shoreline of Lake Mead. Not debris, not the expected detritus of a receding waterline. Geometric patterns in exposed rock formations. Patterns that looked deliberate. He took photographs, shared them with a geology professor at UNLV, and within 2 weeks received a visit from individuals who identified themselves as Bureau of Reclamation officials. They thanked him for his diligence, explained the formations were natural erosion patterns, and strongly suggested he stop sharing the photographs. His camera, which he'd left in his truck during the meeting, was never found. The professor he'd contacted suddenly became unavailable for comment, then transferred to a position in Alaska 3 months later. The photographs Chen had already distributed online disappeared from servers. Not deleted by him, just gone. And when the drought ended and water levels rose again, those formations vanished beneath the surface. But Chen wasn't the only one who'd seen something. Between 2002 and 2007, at least 14 separate reports surfaced describing unusual structures visible during low water periods. Park rangers documented some of them, filed reports, then watched those reports get classified under routine geological surveys. Divers exploring the lake's deeper regions reported finding worked stone at depths that shouldn't contain anything except sediment and drowned trees. One dive team, working under contract for environmental assessment, discovered what they described as a series of rectangular openings in the canyon wall approximately 60 feet below the surface. They submitted their findings with underwater photography showing clear right angles, deliberate spacing, and what appeared to be tool marks on the stone. The contract wasn't renewed. Their footage was requested for further analysis and never returned. What makes these accounts significant isn't their sensational nature. It's their consistency. Different witnesses, different time periods, different parts of the lake, all describing the same basic phenomenon. Structures that predate the dam, proportioned for inhabitants, significantly smaller than modern humans, built with techniques that don't match known regional archaeology. And every time evidence surfaces, quite literally, it gets suppressed with remarkable efficiency. Consider the timeline. The 1832 dam floods the area after reports of a diminutive civilization living in the canyon. Hoover Dam construction in the 1930s encounters and deliberately buries archaeological evidence of the same civilization. and for the next 70 years, whenever lake levels drop enough to expose what lies beneath, that evidence gets documented, then disappeared. 3 separate eras, 3 separate instances of the same pattern. At what point does coincidence become coordination? The Bureau of Reclamation maintains extensive records of everything related to Hoover Dam: construction logs, engineering reports, environmental assessments, maintenance schedules. Their archives span decades, meticulously organised, publicly accessible for researchers. Except for one category. Archaeological findings during construction are referenced in summary documents, but the detailed reports are missing. Not lost, not misfiled. The catalogue numbers exist, the references appear in indexes, but when you request the actual documents, you're told they were never transferred to the current archival system. They exist in the record as having existed, but the contents are unavailable. I submitted a Freedom of Information Act request, standard procedure, perfectly legal. 3 months later, I received a response stating that the requested documents fall under infrastructure security exemptions and cannot be released. Archaeological reports from 1932 are somehow classified as infrastructure security risks 90 years later. Think about what that means. Someone decided that information about what was found during dam construction poses a current security threat. Not historical curiosity, not academic interest, active security concern. What could possibly be threatening about evidence of a small-statured civilization that existed before modern settlement? Unless the threat isn't what they were, but what their existence implies. Because if there was a thriving civilization in Black Canyon before 1832, if that civilization was deliberately flooded, if evidence of their existence has been systematically suppressed for nearly 2 centuries, then we have to ask much larger questions about what else has been erased from the historical record. The dwarf legends don't stop at Black Canyon. Similar accounts appear throughout the American Southwest, always with the same details. Underground dwellings, populations of unusually small people, sudden disappearances. The Paiute tribes speak of the Sea-Teka, red-haired giants who lived in caves, but they also speak of the Nimeriga, a race of small people who lived in the mountains and built structures of stone. The Shoshone have similar accounts. The Hopi describe the ant people who sheltered their ancestors underground. Different names, different tribes, same basic story. Small people, advanced enough to work stone, living in regions that were later flooded or sealed. You start mapping these accounts geographically, and something disturbing emerges. Many of them cluster around current or former reservoir sites. Lake Mead, Lake Powell, Lake Shasta, Elephant Butte Reservoir. Locations where massive amounts of water now cover what was once accessible terrain. Locations where any physical evidence would be permanently submerged, protected from casual discovery, accessible only through official channels that can control what gets reported. And in every case, construction of these reservoirs happened during periods when archaeological preservation wasn't yet standard practice, when evidence could be buried without public outcry. The timing becomes impossible to dismiss when you chart it. The Great Reservoir Construction Era, 1930s through 1960s, happens to coincide with the final consolidation of federal control over Western lands. Before this period, vast territories remained under state jurisdiction or private ownership. After, the Bureau of Reclamation and Army Corps of Engineers controlled millions of acres, all in the name of water management and flood control. But water management requires flooding specific locations. And if those locations happen to contain evidence of civilizations that don't fit accepted timelines, well, that evidence becomes permanently inaccessible behind restricted zones and deep water. I found something in the archives of the Nevada Historical Society that nobody talks about. A letter from 1931, written by a surveyor working on preliminary Hoover Dam site assessments. He describes extensive ruins in Black Canyon, stone structures built into cliff faces, dwellings that showed sophisticated understanding of natural cooling and water collection. He recommends archaeological survey before construction begins. That letter exists. The recommended survey does not. No record it was ever conducted, no documentation of findings, no explanation for why the recommendation was ignored. Just silence, then flooding. What happened to the people who lived there? The official story gives us nothing because it acknowledges nothing. You can't explain the disappearance of people whose existence you refuse to confirm. But the legends are specific. The dwarf people didn't migrate away. They didn't assimilate into other populations. They vanished. Different tribes use different words, but the meaning stays consistent. They were there, then they weren't. And where they lived is now underwater. Here's what makes this especially disturbing. Modern sonar technology could map the lake bottom in extraordinary detail. Ground-penetrating sonar can identify structures, distinguish between natural rock formations and constructed architecture, create three-dimensional images of what lies beneath sediment and water. The technology exists, it's been used in underwater archaeology worldwide, and it would definitively answer whether structures exist at the bottom of Lake Mead. That survey has never been conducted, or if it has, the results have never been made public. The National Park Service, which administers Lake Mead National Recreation Area, maintains that no archaeological sites of significance exist within the reservoir boundaries. But how would they know without surveying? Their confidence seems premature, given that they're making claims about terrain that's been underwater for 90 years. I submitted requests to multiple agencies asking if any sonar surveys had been conducted of Lake Mead's bottom for archaeological purposes. Bureau of Reclamation, no responsive documents. National Park Service, no responsive documents. Army Corps of Engineers, no responsive documents. Either nobody has ever thought to look, which seems unlikely given the legends and the pre-flooding surveyor reports, or somebody looked and didn't like what they found. The Hoover Dam itself might be the most elaborate seal in American history. Not just holding back water, holding back evidence. 36 million cubic yards of water covers Black Canyon now. The pressure at depth makes exploration difficult, dangerous, expensive. Perfect conditions for ensuring certain things stay hidden, and the dam provides the excuse. You can't drain it for archaeological research. The water is too important, the power generation too critical, the political complications too severe. So what lies beneath stays beneath. But lakes drop during droughts. And in the 21st century, climate change is doing what archaeological inquiry never could. Lake Mead's water levels have fallen dramatically, exposing shorelines that haven't seen daylight in decades. And what appears? Structures, stone foundations, arranged rocks that show deliberate placement, artifacts that local archaeologists examine briefly before they are collected by federal authorities for further study that never produces public reports. There's a pattern to how these discoveries are handled. Local news covers the initial finding, usually framed as curiosity or oddity. Then federal agencies arrive, secure the site, remove the artifacts, and issue statements about ongoing analysis. Then silence. The artifacts go to facilities where public access requires navigating bureaucratic mazes that few researchers have patience to endure. And the sites themselves, once water levels rise again, disappear back under the surface. I spoke with a park ranger, off the record, someone who's worked at Lake Mead for 15 years. They've seen things emerge during low water periods, walls built with techniques that don't match anything attributed to known tribes. Tools made from materials not native to the region, evidence of metalworking in locations where indigenous populations supposedly never developed metallurgy. Every time, the same procedure. Document, collect, classify, restrict. The ranger asked me not to use their name because employees who talk about this publicly tend to find themselves reassigned. The dwarf people of Black Canyon might have been small in stature, but what they knew about working with stone, about building structures that lasted centuries, about living in harmony with an unforgiving environment, that knowledge was anything but small. And someone decided it needed to be buried. Not metaphorically, literally, under millions of tons of water, behind the largest dam in America, protected by federal jurisdiction and bureaucratic opacity. The evidence is down there. The question is whether we'll ever be allowed to see it, or whether the reservoir will continue serving its secondary purpose, keeping certain chapters of history permanently submerged, accessible only to those who already know what questions not to ask. The next severe drought is coming. Climate models guarantee it. And when Lake Mead's waters recede far enough, when those stone doorways emerge again from the depths, watch how quickly the restricted zones expand. Watch how efficiently the evidence disappears, because the pattern hasn't changed in nearly 200 years. What surfaces get suppressed, what threatens the narrative gets sealed, and an entire civilization remains drowned, not by accident, but by design. The dwarves of Black Canyon aren't myth, they're buried truth, and the water keeps their secrets better than any vault ever could.